This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students, alumni, and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional career that you're happy with. On this episode, I speak with Jonathan Azoff. With over 15 years of experience in a broad range of tech companies, including name brands like Disney, Zillow, and WeWork earlier in his career, Jonathan is a formidable tech leader and software expert. More recently, he's moved into the role of mentor and investor with a focus on sustainability. His deep commitment to sustainability is evident, having championed impact and innovation in areas like precision agriculture, alternative proteins, and waste upcycling. Through the eyes of a founder, he understands the essence of a mission-driven approach. I'm excited to have Jonathan on the show to talk about his experience, the opportunities he sees for sustainability and clean tech startups, and what kind of opportunities he sees in these startups for job seekers. Jonathan, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thanks for having me. Very exciting. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So I always like to start out by asking about your career path. Now, I alluded to your earlier roles, which was basically as a software engineer in some big name tech companies. You've done a lot of things since. Just give us the highlights of how you got from software engineer to now a mentor, startup mentor, and investor, as well as some of the work outside of that you do these days.
Yeah, sure. So to actually understand how I got to where I am now, you actually have to go pretty far back. You have to go all the way back to high school. For better or worse, I was a bit of a bleeding heart in high school. I was into environmentalism and sustainability, and I was finding myself doing a lot of papers and essays on, the future of fuel. I was convinced for sure we were going to be using, crystal-based fuels and things like that, and gas would be a thing of the past, a relic. That was me then. I was also very much into computing, kind of as a hobbyist, kind of fell into it, sideways at a bunch of sort of work I was doing in graphics, and that kind of led me into programming. At the time in high school, I asked my mentor, where do I go to school? Where can I go to school to go do more of this? And she said, just go to Silicon Valley. That's where everyone's doing it. And I was in Southern California at the time, so I said, sure. I joined a small university, private university, Santa Clara in the South Bay. And I was one of a handful of computer engineering graduates from that program. It's now a significantly larger program, but very small when I was there. And then, just kind of got sucked into the gravitational pull of, Silicon Valley and San Francisco. I did a few startups. I got lucky in the beginning. I went through a couple acquisitions that you called out. First in gaming, I went and joined Disney, got to meet Bob Iger, and that was fun. I also did a real estate software business, and that was acquired by Zillow. And then I went off and started to do more of the founder-centric work. So I did some stuff in fitness. I did a business in logistics. Went through several raises there. Actually grew a team. Got a sort of trial by fire education in engineering leadership. And then that became my career, engineering leadership. I did work at WeWork, as you mentioned, also at Carta, big cap table management business. After that, I basically became a hired gun in software consulting, and I should say also transitioned into investing. On the surface, that would seem like very incongruent, or a very big leap, but actually the subtext is far more telling about how I got there. If you look at why I left every job that I joined, it was always because that sort of bleeding heart that I had in high school was still there, and I would often leave because of moral conviction. I felt like we weren't doing enough in sustainability, or I wasn't doing enough. Maybe just my contribution to society through this role was not what I expected of myself. So I did what any frustrated bleeding heart does. I joined a nonprofit. That nonprofit called Sweet Farm is America's first climate sanctuary. Though when I joined, it was far more animal and ag centric. So that was my exposure into agriculture, food systems, waste systems. And, this is while I was working in tech. So this was like my alternate ego, I guess. And this is before folks were really talking about things like climate tech. And so, we because of our sort of non-dilutive stature, we were there to help founders innovate in these spaces without asking for anything more than their willingness to participate. We got to meet a lot of founders. We got to invest kind of blindly, frankly. We didn't really know what we were doing. After a while, we started to grow conviction about what matters. And that's when I had this aha moment that I should be getting involved in this, that this is where I can actually have a job that allows me to feel fulfilled and morally aligned with my work and not give up, the sort of rigor and technical requirements of a job like software engineering. So, one thing led to another, and I can certainly go into it, but we ultimately started SNØCAP, me and two other partners, and we're already actively investing and continuing to raise. So it's a fun and dynamic time, and indeed, I've fully transitioned into financial services as a career now.
When you think about your early career, what are some of the skills or experiences that you think have helped you be successful at where you are now?
Yeah, so
because it's obviously it's
perhaps,
not like JavaScript and Python coding, right? I mean, it's something else from let's say the first 10 years of your career that have carried you forward into the second 10 years.
Yeah, it's a good question. This question's a hard one to answer because there's a lot of stuff out there about what matters. Like, you'll read blog posts, 10 things successful people do in the morning to have great outcome. Like, that's not me. Like, my roles, routines have changed so many times. Like, it's not anything like that. I think if anything, it's maybe a little deeper. So I'm a big fan of Angela Duckworth and her sort of concepts on grit and tenacity. In some ways, that's probably the most American part of me, even though I'm a first-generation American. I believe strongly in that sort of determinism, and grit can kind of solve all problems. And the thing that gets talked about less is also luck. So I think, athletes often talk about making their own luck. And I think that's like a very understated and important attribute. So if I was sort of feet to the coals and was like, tell us what the thing is, I would say it's probably some combination of grit and learning how to make your own luck, putting yourself in the right position where you can't really predict what will happen, but if something happens, you're in a better spot than most to capitalize on that moment. For me, that was really getting involved with a group of people who I really admired in the nonprofit space, who were driven to do more than just simply, educate people. They wanted to push innovation forward. And so that was my sort of pivotal exposure. And then the grit really came down to continuing to work in a field and in industries that maybe I wasn't morally aligned with, but that would carry me long enough that I could fully transition safely, with my family and with all the sort of obligations I have outside of work. So those two things really, I think, carried me through to where I
do love the idea of making your own luck. I think I've heard it described as, when opportunity and preparation intersect. And that, I think, is key. And the only way that happens usually, and it sounds like this was your approach, was getting out there and exploring and making connections and sticking with it until those two lines intersected on the graph, the preparation and the opportunity, the connections and the preparation. Maybe it's even three lines that intersected at the right time that you were able to make a jump in a different direction.
Yeah, your listeners are probably familiar with the sort of framing of knowns and unknowns. And there's often a two-dimensional graph of your known knowns, your known unknowns, your unknown unknowns, so on and so forth. And I think part of creating your own luck is allowing yourself as many opportunities as possible to be in the known unknowns category, right? And practically speaking, that could be things like forcing yourself to network more often than maybe you'd be comfortable with, or showing up to events that are maybe tangentially aligned to things that you would have normally gone to. It's the conversation you don't expect to have that can sometimes change your perspective and change the direction of where you're going. For me, once again, I have all sorts of tricks and gimmicks in my life that try to force me into that known unknowns thing. Like, for instance, there's a service lunch club I like them a lot. They force me to meet new people every week, even on a week where I'm burnt out and I'm just like, I don't want to meet anyone else. It's like, I've got this calendar invite and I'm going to let someone down if I don't meet them. And, some of those conversations have turned into friendships. And I think like can't be overstated that living in the known unknowns is really helpful and healthy for the plasticity of your brain and for the outcomes in your life.
I love the idea of lunch club. We can feel resistant to going out there and meeting people, and especially now we're in this sort of post-pandemic existence where we've had a lot of time on our own, and we might think, I don't really want to go out to that event tonight. And then you go, and it's like you break that coefficient of friction, and now you're there and you get energized. You meet new people. And, I talk to my students about this all the time. Getting out there and meeting people is a really important part of business school. And for any job seeker, being out there, making connections, that is going to exponentially increase the number of opportunities that come your way, as well as your preparation when those opportunities do come your way. Let's shift gears. I want to hear a little bit about the kind of companies that you're considering for investment and where you see opportunity here in 2023, Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure Jobs Act, CHIPS Act, all of this investment coming into clean tech. We're obviously in the midst of a summer that has dealt significant climate chaos around the globe. What are you looking at, and where do you see the biggest opportunities in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with just the framing, like the biggest opportunities. We as a society already know what the biggest opportunities are, and we've already put dramatic resources towards the quote unquote biggest opportunities, right? These are going to be your big three: land use, energy, and transportation, right? These are all like incredibly massive sectors that have, the lion's share of our emissions globally. What I try to focus on is, instead of simply looking at scale does matter to us, but it is only one part of our overall thesis. The two other parts of our thesis deal more in the aspects of businesses that we care about. So the first aspect deals largely in commercial viability. So one of the challenges right now in climate innovation or climate conscious innovation is that a lot of the stuff that could really move the needle costs a lot of money, right? This is this sort of trope of hard tech, if you're familiar with, any sort of VC investing in hardware.
Hard tech, like you're talking about things that exist in the physical world that require manufacturing,
correct.
That require being moved around. So not software, like hardware instead of software.
Correct. And if you look at the origin story of VC often touts itself as risk capital. It's like another metaphor that VCs, at least the first tier of VCs, would often describe their capital as. It's this sort of catalytic risk capital that allows businesses to exist that would otherwise not exist because they were too risky, right? But what that has largely turned into is unrisky capital. Like now it is so known that software businesses can grow so fast that what was risk capital is arguably like some of the unriskiest capital out there. Like VC outperforms, public benchmarks regularly as an industry, like as an aggregate. And that's not something, to take lightly. So the second we talk about shifting the lens to now, what are the new risky thresholds? Suddenly VC has become very reticent, right? We're used to those great multiples, those great returns. The irony is, we see those great returns as still available in these sort of quote unquote risky categories. The trick is just understanding how to de-risk them. And that's where having an engineering background, and my co-founders are also engineers as well, I should say, and mechanical engineers at that. So we have a range of sort of understanding. Coming back to the thesis, how we apply this in practice is we look for businesses that can be commercially viable at a scale that is appropriate for VC, even though they are in these hard tech type categories, or deep tech as it's often called as well. So how do we do that personally? We work our way up supply chains. So every business, practically every business, lives within some sort of supply chain or some sort of value chain. And if you think about complexity of a product, the most complex product you'll ever have is the one you receive as a consumer. As you work your way up the supply chain or backwards up a value chain, the products become simpler, right? And that's how value is created. You combine simple things into more complex things, right? This is the history of industrialization 101. At its simplest form, you have something that probably has a carbon impact. A perfect example of this is plastics. Plastics are almost universally generated from petroleum or petrochemical manufacturing, right? You take oil and you steam crack it, you get all these monomers and polymers, and then you can make plastics. And this is how we get our phones and practically everything. And because we have such high standards as consumers, we almost always create virgin material. We create this from the source. We don't recycle it. We recycle, the last time I cared to look, 8% of what we use as a society. So very small amount ever actually re-enters the supply chain. So that's pretty awful. How can I find something commercially viable in that chain? Well, as things get simpler, they scale faster, right? Think about plastics once again. Plastics don't just exist in one industry. They exist in every industry. So if you can fix something high enough up in that supply chain, you can affect every industry. So there's your scale, not just from an impact perspective, but also from a commercial perspective. So what we look for in our fund is those opportunities that don't sacrifice ecological superiority for economic superiority. We look for an innovation that makes something that someone would normally buy cheaper. And just by making it cheaper, they choose to buy it. It just so happens that it is also ecologically superior. There are plenty of smart, driven people focusing on behavior change. And I think that's an important part of the climate story. But when we think about our role to play as a fund and as a financial institution, we're really interested in avoiding behavior change. We're looking at all the people who are unwilling to change and just trying to figure out how they make decisions and help them make the normal decision they would make have a better impact for the planet. And within those small opportunities come huge potential impact, huge returns. And that's what gets us excited, and that's how we focus as a fund.
So a lot of hard tech, hardware companies, the founders are engineers, whether it's mechanical, electrical, chemical, and a lot of the early hires are in that same space to figure it out. Like, how do we scale manufacturing? You're going to require people with engineering backgrounds. At what point do you see the business folks getting involved, the finance manager, the marketer, the product manager? And so, like, what's that sweet spot of company size or age? And then what are the kind of roles that you see some of these companies that you invest in starting to hire for?
Yeah, the short answer for when they should get involved is, or like when they are getting involved, is not soon enough. Like, they are not getting involved soon enough. And here's why. I'll give you a small metaphor from my own career. So when I joined the software engineering profession, I was greeted with a sort of experience that I don't think a lot of people have. It's a sort of privilege that is kind of unique to software engineering, because there is so much money in that field and companies compete for interest, that you create this sort of psychology within software engineers that we are the center of the universe. That our tools, our products are in and of themselves intrinsically valuable, and the value, it should be intrinsically appreciated. And we discount the business related to that. And as I've kind of gone through my career and I've moved into like leadership roles, and I've started to appreciate the work that's involved in, say, projecting cash flows, into the future, I realized how small-minded that was. And I think I also kind of still see it. It's still there. It's a pervasive mentality. And it's not just in software. It's just very pervasive in software. So let's come back to this idea of plastics, right? Often innovation is happening in academia. It's not always happening there. If it's, you have some technology coming out of academia, you maybe have a professor who's received tens of millions of dollars to come up with an innovation, and they're ready to take a small stake in a company, maybe put one of their PhD candidates or postdocs in front of this product and have them run with this company. And so you have this tremendous, it's almost like an iceberg where you only see the top and there's all this underwater iceberg. You have all this underwater iceberg propping up this little idea, and they feel that energy. They feel like, look how great this idea is. We've spent a decade developing this. And what they get on the tail end of that is something very similar to what all those software engineers feel, which is this intrinsic value. You should just appreciate it, right? But what business brings to the table is a narrative and a story. And it does it in the form of financials and in the form of slide decks that tells that story in a way that makes it make sense for the future. Like, now that you've gotten here, what does it actually look like, right? What does my money do to change that outcome if I were an investor? And unfortunately, a lot of these early deals, these highly potentially valuable technologies, die on the vine. They can't raise funding, especially right now where the market has tightened a bit. They can't raise money. And it's not because their technology isn't good enough. It's because they didn't get a business counterpart. They almost either discounted the business counterpart, or they just kind of assumed that this intrinsic value would carry them through. And, to their credit, some founders can do that. They can actually just plow a good idea all the way through to a first round of fundraising. Often I see this happen through accelerators. So an accelerator will happily take 7% of your company or more, for a pittance of an investment, and they may give you some business coaching, but that doesn't actually ultimately solve your problem. You still will have to pitch an investor at some point, and you will have to have a good business proposition. If you are only surviving on that one aspect, then it's hard. It's hard to go out and actually convince anyone beyond that surface level deck or something like that.
So you'd say that a hard tech company or even a software company where the early stages are developing the idea, coming up with the technology, there's sort of like almost a pure science exploration and invention aspect of that. And it's sort of like the war of the currents between Tesla and Edison, right? Edison was a much better salesperson and businessman than Tesla was. And Tesla died, penniless in a hotel room. And Edison, we all remember everything about his invention of the light bulb, which he didn't really invent, right? And all that stuff. So you're saying bring in the business folks sooner, bring in the marketing person to help tell the story, to find that product market fit, bring in the finance person to figure out the cash flows and the projections, so that as a founder, as an early stage company, you can be more savvy when getting in front of investors and pitching and trying to get your product to market.
It's almost not, yes, there's definitely a savviness to it, but there's also this other, like, more just fundamental thing that I think is missed. If you're used to spending your entire career, like 10 years, getting money to further a technology, your relationship with money is that money funds technology. When you're getting in front of an investor, you're asking for money to fund a business, not a technology. Right? The technology is the enabling factor of your business, the thing that makes it unique and defensible, right? But it is not the business de facto. Much like Betamax was a superior technology, but it was not as well suited to be a business as VHS was, right? And we could pontificate for hours about all of these sort of Tesla, Edison, like all these cases where that was the case. But the second you're ready to get in front of an investor, ask yourself, am I selling a technology or am I selling a business? Right? Because investors invest in businesses. They don't invest in technologies unless they're philanthropic and giving money to a PhD program, in which case they are investing in technologies. But that, like, to be clear, it is very much a business proposition that folks like myself and other investors look at and invest in.
So when you think about these companies, what is the business person that you would like to see in that founding team or in that early team? What order of hiring is it? So you've got the founder, CEO, and you have a CTO essentially, probably. What are the next couple roles? And then what advice do you have for a job seeker who maybe doesn't have extensive experience, but really wants to move into that space and into these young and high growth potential companies that are in the climate tech or sustainability space?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer perfectly, especially because in that question there was an implication that like a CEO might already exist, and in many cases they do. The co-founder or the founder, in some cases, maybe it's a PhD student or a professor, feels strongly that they need to be the CEO. But I think often like that does them a disservice because maybe their focus isn't actually defining the business, and that's okay. Like we need experts, we need expert technologists, and we need expert business folks. As far as like unpacking what business actually means and what's relevant, I think it really comes down to, creating a story. So the nice thing, the sort of simplifying assumption with fundraising for a business is that every business can be myopic when at least it's focusing on fundraising, insofar as you just need to be able to tell the story about how the capital you receive today brings you to the next checkpoint. And the fidelity and accuracy by which your checkpoints are right on the money can kind of decrease over time. Like, I don't expect you to have perfect clarity about what your business will look like in 10 years, but I expect you to have more clarity about 8 years and 6 years and so on and so forth. And by the time we're talking about next year, I want to have a pretty good sense about what you think your business is going to look like, right? So it's hard to say exactly what that role is. Maybe it's marketing, but honestly, it's some form of storytelling. And how you use and influence people through that storytelling comes down to the audience, right? Audiences are influenced in different ways. So like, for instance, if you're pitching an institution, they may want to see gap compliant sort of cash flow projections, well out into the future, because that's how they check the box for thinking about your story. For a impassioned impact investor who runs, their family office and they want to just see impact in the world, maybe you're spending a lot more time actually talking about how the technology itself can intersect all sorts of parts of our lives that are parts that are maybe relevant to that person. It's funny, when we apply for jobs, we're often given the advice to, write a cover letter, tune your resume for the place you're applying to, like do all this work to make yourself appealing. You're selling your product, to this company. In some ways, fundraising is no different. Know your audience and recognize that like you are telling a story about the value of this product and of this business. And if you're not well suited to do that, that's also okay. Just find the person who is. You may not need the financial CEO or CFO for your first fundraise. You may need it for your second or your third, right? But focus on the story you're trying to tell about your business. And if you don't know that story, that's also okay. A technology can be valuable without a good business story attached to it, but go find the business story, right? Before you start pitching an investor or someone who's interested in businesses.
All right. So then advice to the job seeker who wants to work for a company that's bringing technologies to the market that are going to help us solve the climate crisis, or going to reduce our carbon footprint or our impact on the biosphere. What would you say to a job seeker on the business side, not the engineering technology side, about making themselves appealing, like you said, with a cover letter and the resume, but making themselves an appealing candidate? If they don't have a 10-year track record of experience doing that kind of job, there's this, it's not a joke, but it's an observation that a lot of job descriptions for sustainability roles are looking, for 7 to 10 years experience doing X, Y, Z in the sustainability space. And nobody has it. There are very few people on the market who have that kind of experience. So how would you advise a person who wants to get into this space to position themselves?
Right. I'm the kid of two entrepreneurs. I have a very strong founder bent. And my reaction to there isn't the right job for me is then go build that job. That's probably why I got into investing, is I was frustrated that I couldn't find the right job for me, right? And now, not everyone has the explicit privilege to be able to float for long enough to raise and start a company, but it's a transformative and amazingly enlightening experience. And I encourage everyone to at least try as best they can to start a business. And if you're interested in climate, we need way more innovation, way more often and way more regular than is currently happening. So if your instinct is to go into a job immediately, that's all well and good, but know that like you don't have to allow yourself to get fully frustrated. Like you can go create the reality you want for yourself. The other thing I would say is just as far as like how to approach it, I have a bias that, at least within climate tech is a point in time term. For instance, like, for listeners, I'm holding my phone in my hand. It's an iPhone. We used to call this a smartphone. I don't really hear anyone calling it a smartphone anymore. And the reason for that is pretty self-evident. The other type of phone doesn't exist. The qualifier is ambiguous. And I think climate tech is similar insofar as, like, anything that has climate consciousness built into it is climate tech. But that's everything. Everything needs to be decarbonized in order for us to, meet the targets, the 2050 targets that I think a lot of us are terrified about not hitting. So if that's really the case, I don't think we should be focusing on, like, what is available to me today. I think we should be asking ourselves, what part of my lived experience am I most drawn towards? And let me go focus on that. Right? Because there is almost certainly a carbon problem lurking somewhere in that supply chain that you're interacting with, right? Like, for me, it was my food. I was really deeply interested in my food. And so that's how I got involved in nonprofit. And that's what led me down this sort of inevitable path to investing. I think for others, you may find other aspects of your life that are really important. And look, it's a big world, and carbon impacts us all. You will find someone else who had the same realization. And if they're not starting a company, you might start it together. I think, like, that's the beautiful thing about climate compared to practically any other industry, is, like, it's a wide open field and everything matters. So I would just encourage folks to dig in and think about what matters to them.
All right. As we come to the end of our time together, I always like to ask if there are any recommendations that you have for websites, podcasts, books that you think people interested in this space should check out, or that were particularly instrumental or continue to be in your career and thinking around this.
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll start this by saying I don't read as much as I used to, which is really unfortunate. And I want to get back to getting into more longer form nonfiction. But
young children will do that.
Yeah,
I'm just coming out the other side of that and finding the time to really tackle longer books.
Okay, so a couple of thoughts. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's light at the end of the tunnel, I suppose. Right. So the first book I'd recommend is Complexity by Melanie Mitchell. She's a professor at the New Mexico Institute. They focus on complexity as a science, and it's a systems problem. So they bring together people of a lot of different disciplines to think about complex problems and emergent sort of characteristics of those problems. Like a perfect example of complexity in action is ants. Individually, they're pretty predictable and kind of useless, but as a collective, they can do all sorts of interesting things, like make bridges out of their bodies that other ants walk over. That's complexity in action. I think when you think about climate is a complexity problem. Everything is interacting with everything else. So how do you avoid feedback loops and, make decisions that don't actually bite you, like investing in forests for carbon offsets and then having them burn, right? Like, what happens then? So I think there is a lot of value in thinking about complexity as a science and investing in it and thinking about it and caring deeply about systems. The other one I would recommend is Thinking in Bets. I believe it's Annie Duke, World Series of Poker champion, also a brilliant statistician and thinker. Her book is largely targeted at business leaders who are trying to make better decisions. And it calls into pretty profound contrast the way we make decisions versus the way we should make decisions based off of science and data. And I really appreciated it more than anything because it gives you tools and anecdotes that I guess give you a sense of calm as you're thinking about really hard decisions. So if folks are kind of leaving school and thinking about their next job, it can be helpful. And it will help you in your career as well as you're making decisions as a leader. I'll probably stop there. Those are two very dense books. I have others. Feel free to reach out to me, if you have more questions on recommendations, but that's a good place to start.
Well, thank you so much. We'll certainly put links to those in the show notes, as well as to where folks can find you on LinkedIn and elsewhere. I'll just take an opportunity to mention the Work on Climate community, which is in part how we first met about a year and some change ago, which can be found on workonclimate.org, which is a fantastic resource of people around the world, as well as events, books, resources, jobs, and information about particular industries and subsectors within this space. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking this time to have a conversation on careers and professional life.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I really enjoyed the conversation with Jonathan. 3 key things I took away from it are that whether you're a founder or are looking to get into the clean tech space, you need a lot of grit and more than a little luck. But as the saying goes, luck is when preparation and opportunity meet. You can create your own luck through that preparation and putting yourself out there so that you find the potential opportunities that might exist. Next is that investors invest in businesses, not in technologies. You can have an amazing idea, an amazing technology, but if you can't explain the business story to investors, you might be sunk. This presents a great opportunity for MBAs who can work with the scientist or inventor to both design and articulate the business case for their new technology. Last, many climate tech startups probably need to bring more business people into the mix earlier than they do. Again, this is an opportunity for the business-minded job seeker out there. Find the interesting early-stage companies and show how you can add value, whether that is developing a pitch deck, researching customers, or developing sales models. Jonathan and I had such a good time talking on this podcast, as well as at events where we've seen each other around town, that we've decided to create a mini-series on the Conversations on Careers and Professional Life podcast. Those episodes will come out in January 2024, where we'll talk with the founders of climate tech startups about their businesses, about their careers, and their advice for job seekers looking to break into the climate tech space. As always, find it on conversationsoncareers.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or classmate. Help others find the show by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Conversations on Careers and Professional Life is produced by me, Gregory Heller, with support from the Foster School of Business Office of MBA Career Management. Learn more about the show, find show notes, and past episodes, and get in touch with me at conversationsoncareers.com. This episode was produced with editing and engineering support from Amelia Nguyen, a student in the Communication Leadership Master's Program at the University of Washington, and made possible in part with funding from SNØCAP, a venture capital firm investing in early-stage platforms that directly and indirectly solve the climate crisis. Learn more at snocap.vc. That's SNOCAP.vc.